Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. Now then, my guest today is from very far off indeed. Takes hours and hours and hours of flying time to get there. And it's a country where, I'm not giving you any tips, but you know, it's a country where humanoids are outnumbered about 6 to 1 by sheep. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome not the 6 sheep, but the High Commissioner of New Zealand to Sri Lanka, His Excellency Michael Appleton. Very good evening, Ambassador and or High Commissioner, and welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me.
Great pleasure. Now then, is that true? 6 to 1?
Yes, 6 to 1, something like that. There are 5 million New Zealanders, and there are about 25 to 30 million sheep in New Zealand. Yeah.
So they must have an awful lot of pasturing land available to them.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand is a very large country geographically, so we're about 4 times larger geographically than Sri Lanka, but we have a quarter of the people. So there is a lot of wide open spaces, and we have for a very long time used a significant portion of our land for agriculture. So we make a significant amount of money from beef, from lamb, from dairy products that we use our wide open spaces to produce.
And how's the economy doing? What sort of per capita GDP do you have now in New Zealand?
I mean, I think every country in the world has been badly affected by COVID, but we, because we're an export-oriented economy, have been more insulated than some. So our economy is holding up fairly well. We are facing significant cost of living challenges, although far more modest than Sri Lanka is, and inflation is starting to become a bit of an issue. But we continue to have very low unemployment of about 3%, and our economy remains robust because the things that New Zealand makes its money through, things like agriculture, like tourism, those are things that have held up and that are rebounding too through the post-COVID period.
I see. The High Commission in Colombo is pretty new, right?
Yeah, it's about 18 months old. I've been here for about 18 months, and actually our 2 governments, the Sri Lankan and New Zealand governments, announced when Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister visited New Zealand in 2016, so I guess 6 years ago now, that our 2 countries would open High Commissions in each other's countries, and I guess it took sort of 4.5 years for us to make good on that promise. That was partly due to COVID and a number of other factors that it took that long, but the primary reason that we made that decision to open a High Commission in Sri Lanka is that we feel that if we invest a little bit more in the relationship, that we'll be able to create more value both for New Zealanders and for Sri Lankans. We think the trade and economic relationship, the education relationship, the sport and cultural relationship, these are all things that we can do more together, and that it is much easier to do those things if you have an office, a High Commission on the ground. And so that's what we've been trying to do. I guess it's been quite an unusual time to be opening a High Commission. I mean, I got here in the middle of last year, so while the COVID lockdowns were still happening in Sri Lanka, and then obviously that then transitioned this year into this very deep economic crisis, and that's quite a challenging context for opening a High Commission and for building economic partnerships between our 2 countries. But we're obviously trying to do our best, trying to be part of the efforts of the Sri Lankan government and civil society and business and the Sri Lankan people to try to contribute to a recovery from this crisis for Sri Lanka.
Talking about helping Sri Lanka in its probably in its most darkest period in its independent history, how can New Zealand help Sri Lanka, and how is it helping Sri Lanka?
Well, I mean, one of the first things that we decided back in sort of April, May was that there was a significant humanitarian crisis coming as a result of the economic crisis that we wanted to contribute to. So we contributed about $1.5 million to efforts to help Sri Lankans who didn't have enough to eat, to help Sri Lankan farmers who didn't have the necessary inputs to get necessary harvests. And I mean, that's our contributions, a modest contribution to the international effort. But so that was the first part. But I think sort of, you know, moving forward or looking into the future, one thing that we feel is that New Zealand has considerable expertise in the very areas of policy reform that the Sri Lankan government and Sri Lankan society is considering now in response to the economic crisis. We went through our own economic crisis, which had many of the same hallmarks as the Sri Lankan crisis in the mid-1980s, and in response to that, we reformed virtually every single part of our government, every single part of our economy, so that we could future-proof it and ensure that we didn't find ourselves again in a position of crisis. And so the expertise that we built up through that experience is something that we very much want to share with the Sri Lankan authorities, and it is something that we have started to share. So we recently had, as an example, a visitor who used to be in a leadership position in our Reserve Bank, who's been working very closely with the Sri Lankan Central Bank from the governor on down to really help with the reform to monetary policy, the independence of the central bank, various other reforms that are being considered. So that's just a small example of the kinds of things that we can try to assist with, and we'll be looking for other policy areas where we might be able to help with expertise as well.
And whilst New Zealand is doing all these you know, efforts really to help Sri Lanka help itself, how does any government, not necessarily New Zealand, but how do you view the significant levels of corruption or departures from processes here that is widely reported upon and so on?
I mean, I think obviously wouldn't want to comment on individual cases, but I think that there's no getting around the fact that Sri Lanka will not recover fully from its economic crisis if it also doesn't make reforms to its governance, to the way that it is governed, and to its political culture. These are things I think that politicians of all sides have said since the crisis. So I'm not saying anything earth-shattering there, but I think it is also something that has been, you know, clearly an aspect of the discussions with the IMF. You know, the IMF's position is that, you know, understandably, said this through its public comments, we don't want to have a negotiation with a bailout negotiation with Sri Lanka in 2002 only to be back in the same place in 2004, 2005, because the same governance challenges which led Sri Lanka here in the first place are still there as we get through this crisis. So I think those issues are very serious ones. Those are issues that absolutely need to be tackled as part of this package. And I would say just to hark back to New Zealand's experience too, that these are issues, countering corruption, having an efficient public service that is focused on outcomes, not on you know, self-enlargement, having governance of public sector organisations or state-owned enterprises that are about the national interest, not the personal interest of those that run them. Those are things that were relevant to our reforms as well, and something that we put a lot of emphasis in. Now in New Zealand, if you look at the global indicators when it comes to good governance and corruption and all of these things, New Zealand ranks very highly on those things. And I think anybody who analyses our economy and why we are the country we are today and able to sustain a high standard of living for our people would conclude that these governance issues, combating corruption, having zero tolerance for corruption, including in the political system, that these are things that are vital for a robust economy. You can't separate those two things out. You can't say, oh, we can make the economy function well, but we will just leave governance, you know, in a corrupt state. That doesn't work. You have to tackle both things.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for the answer. Can I ask you, how can New Zealand facilitate trade and also I've got a question here, students and so on, education.
Well, on the student side, I would say that I know from personal experience that there is a huge demand of young Sri Lankans who are keen to come and study in New Zealand. That is something that we very much welcome. Our education system has been enriched for decades and will continue to be enriched by Sri Lankans coming to New Zealand and contributing to all parts of our economy, whether as doctors or as nurses or as midwives. Or as engineers or as lawyers. You know, the Sri Lankan community in New Zealand is large and is contributing greatly to our society, and that starts with these education flows. One thing that is we are seeing more and more between New Zealand universities and Sri Lankan educational institutions to try and make it more affordable for Sri Lankans to come to New Zealand is to have a partnership, a partnering arrangement where the Sri Lankan student can start their degree in Sri Lanka, maybe do the first year, even the first 2 years in Sri Lanka, and then transfer to the New Zealand university for the final 2 years.
So that bring the cost down.
That will bring the cost down because the costs, you obviously, while you're in Sri Lanka, you have much lower costs. Potentially because you're staying with family. So those kind of partnering arrangements are happening more and more, and I think that's very welcome. On the trade and economic front more generally, a core part of why we have a High Commission is that we are trying to grow and diversify the trade and economic relationship between our two countries. It has been for decades dominated by New Zealand selling large amounts of milk powder to Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka selling large amounts of tea to New Zealand. We think there should be a more diverse mix of products and services that we're selling to each other. One of the constraints at the moment is obviously Sri Lanka's economic crisis. New Zealand companies considering where we might expand to at the moment. What they will know about Sri Lanka is the current crisis. So I think that those efforts to get more New Zealand companies interested in operating and investing here, that's likely to be delayed a little bit. But we certainly see that as a big opportunity that we're going to try and harness as well.
And what about what about illegal migration? And before I ask you about regular migration, maybe you can answer both. Is illegal migration a big problem for New Zealand from Sri Lanka?
Well, I think it's no secret that there have been for many years operations launched from Sri Lanka, which is essentially criminal organisations trying to convince Sri Lankans to get on a boat in order to travel long distances in order to illegally get into another country. And there have been historically there have been various destinations for that. What we're seeing at the moment, I guess, is a couple of things. One is that the economic crisis has generated more people who are desperate to leave Sri Lanka because of their economic circumstance. And so the pool of people that these criminal organisations are able to prey on has expanded. That's one thing. I guess the second thing we are seeing that some of these criminal organisations are targeting New Zealand. That is to say that when they approach these vulnerable people and try and get them to come on boats with them, they will say, we can get you to New Zealand. So one thing that we're very focused on, the High Commission, is working with Sri Lankan authorities, but also the authorities of other interested countries to try to detect, disrupt and stop such ventures before they put the lives of these people at risk. We saw last week 300 Sri Lankans, over 300 Sri Lankans, almost lose their lives off Vietnam because the vessel that they'd been put into by these criminal organisations was not large enough and was not seaworthy enough to get to the destination they were hoping to get to. And thank goodness that the quick work of various authorities saved their lives, but this illustrates the danger that these organisations pose to the people that they're preying on, that they could end up in the months ahead killing hundreds, thousands of Sri Lankans whose only crime is to be desperate economically and be willing to pay some money to get on a boat to go somewhere that these people who are putting them on the boats know they are never going to get to. and I think that's the shameful thing about it. So this is an issue that we're very concerned about. We have somebody in our High Commission who is very focused on this issue, who comes from the New Zealand government's security sector, and the reason he's in our mission is we're worried about this issue and we want to contribute to trying to prevent it from happening and also prevent harm to the people who are being preyed on.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner Michael Appleton, the New Zealand representative in Sri Lanka. We're going for a short break and we'll take a peek at this evening's headlines put out by that wonderful and young and dynamic News First primetime news team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukut.
News First headlines. Main sponsor.
Anka ege araksita iti ginipetti. Surya ginipetti.
90 Sri Lankan women abused in Oman under the care of the Sri Lankan embassy. Protest opposite police headquarters against repression. Detained under the PTA. What will be the fate of student leaders when detention period lapses on Friday? Kirialla's question on dollar revenue generation heats up Parliament. South African president celebrates birthday in Sri Lanka. Danushka Gunatilaka granted bail in case of alleged sexual assault. President Xi rebukes Justin Trudeau over leaks to media about Canada-China relations.
News First headlines. Main sponsor.
Anka ege araksita iti ginipetti. Surya ginipetti.
25% for 2 months, 25.5% for 4 months. Valuable FD.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukut.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. We are this evening in conversation with the High Commissioner for New Zealand in Sri Lanka, High Commissioner Michael Appleton. Welcome back, and once again, thank you for coming on Newsline Live.
Lovely to be here.
High Commissioner, what about New Zealand's concern, I suppose, for the people of Sri Lanka? The government of New Zealand have, or perhaps even, co-sponsored UN resolutions on various matters that they expect Sri Lanka to do. Is that what it is? Is that a concern for the people of Sri Lanka, that they need to be having an equitable lifestyle like everybody else in the world?
Yeah, I mean, with respect to the Human Rights Council, I mean, we take every issue, every country on its merits, and I think certainly since the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, we've been keen to ensure that the international community can contribute to efforts in Sri Lanka to create a post-conflict society which is harmonious and which contributes to social peace. And the resolution of the Human Rights Council over many years, I know can be sometimes contentious in Sri Lanka in certain quarters, but from the New Zealand perspective, what we are describing in those in that resolution about post-war reconciliation is sort of describing the sorts of steps that we think would contribute to Sri Lanka growing as a harmonious, diverse society, and we come from that from the perspective of a country that itself is very diverse, has a broad range of different communities that have than some of those communities that have in the past had difficult relationships, and we believe very strongly that it's the role of a government to try to bring people together. So that's that aspect of it. I think this year about the resolution, we also felt that it was important to describe, given this period of crisis, the areas of human rights that we think it was important are upheld and preserved in this period of crisis. Because I think it can sometimes feel easy in periods of calm to observe human rights norms, but it's when a country is in crisis and people and authorities are under pressure that these human rights norms are truly tested. And so there are things that we have said, you know, from the beginning of the crisis that we think it's important are preserved. You know, one of them is the right to peaceful protest, that you can go out onto the street and you can say what you think about what's happening in Sri Lanka and not have your liberty taken away from you. That's one thing. There are others as well. You know, that the justice system treats people equally. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you have very little or you're a politician in the most prestigious office that you can imagine. The justice system should treat everybody equally. So there are these things that there are these principles that we think are important, that we have that I have sometimes spoken about through the crisis. My colleagues in the international community have, the New Zealand government has stated, and that is coming from the perspective of a friend of Sri Lanka, that you know, Sri Lankans this year have gone through an extremely difficult set of circumstances and continue to do so, and we just want to be helpful with the various actors in this situation to try and encourage a dealing with this crisis that is conducive to everybody feeling that they can have their say and that their rights are not going to be infringed.
High Commissioner, we come to this other issue. I've got many questions about that, but in essence, does New Zealand have a preset number of regular migrants that they accept every year, or is that dependent on the needs of your you know, companies? And
no, there isn't a preset number. We do have what's called a green list, which is a few dozen professions which we have identified as we are unable to fill our needs of our labour market via New Zealanders, and so we're actively hoping for applications from people. So those are things all the way from things in the health sector like nurses and midwives and surgeons to engineers to builders. There are a broad range of things on that list, and essentially, you know, if you have skills in that particular area, I would very much encourage a Sri Lankan who's qualified in one of those areas and wishes to spend time in New Zealand to look at it seriously.
Thank you. We must take this question because I'm sure that it is of utmost importance to both our nations, and there'll be a big community out there listening to the answer, and that is this. You've told us how you hope to facilitate trade and humanitarian aid and so on, and even to encourage a better equitable lifestyle for everyone. But what about facilitating and promoting the game of cricket and cricket playing people? You know, how about more experience? Is it something that New Zealand will want to do, to encourage Sri Lankans to get a bit more experience, get some youngsters out in New Zealand and so on and so forth? Or would New Zealand say, no, they're pretty good at this thing and we don't really want to teach them?
You know, I think that's an excellent idea with young people. I mean, the other thing is about Sri Lankan cricketers. We have, I think, for decades had Sri Lankans have come and played, because our seasons are different, come and played in New Zealand. So Aravinda de Silva, when I was growing up, played regularly for Auckland, both in 4-day cricket and 1-day cricket, and that kind of thing I think is great for fostering links. But I also think one thing I'm hoping now that the COVID period is over is that more school groups from New Zealand who do tours of other countries, trying to learn more about other countries but also learn different skills, that a number of them might come to Sri Lanka, and hopefully vice versa too. I think one of the great benefits of that is that our conditions are extremely difficult, are different, I should say. Our pitches and Sri Lankan pitches are very different, and by travelling to each other's countries you can learn and expand your skill set, because you know, what you're being asked to do as a batter or a bowler is quite different in the two countries.
And are there many New Zealand students who come on exchange programs to Sri Lanka, maybe spend their gap years here working with our elephants or wildlife and whatever?
There are some, but not huge numbers. The New Zealanders who tend to come here as tourists, and so they may spend, you know, up to 2-3 months here. And often it is in that gap period between finishing university and starting in the workforce. This is a very popular destination for such New Zealanders. But I think the idea of getting more New Zealand students to come here and spend a bit of their university studies here, even if it's only one semester, so 6 months or something, is definitely something that we're wanting to pursue. And all the New Zealand universities who are building these partnerships with Sri Lankan institutions, that's part of their plan too, is to try and get more New Zealanders to come here for you know, a portion of their degree.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes. So I suppose the last bit, we've got 2 questions, but one, how strong is the in New Zealand your laws that control political funding?
So there are restrictions on how much you can donate. There's restrictions on how much you can donate without the political party having to declare who has donated, and then there are also restrictions on how much political parties can spend. All of those restrictions together are aimed at ensuring that it is not possible, by having way more money than your opponents, you know, to buy yourself electoral success. And I think those another limit is on how much TV time you're allowed to use in terms of advertising. That is allocated to political parties. There is an amount of time you're allowed, and you can't buy any more. So those kinds of restrictions are aimed at ensuring, as much as possible, a level playing field. But these things are always controversial. Whatever restrictions you put in place, political parties, some of them won't like them, and some of them will. So, but they are an important safeguard to democracy, I think. And
finally, I suppose, tell us, how are the Sri Kiwi community doing over there?
Really well. I think there's about 20,000 Sri Lankan New Zealanders, although I like how you described them there. They are contributing hugely to New Zealand society, and I think this year they have thought a lot about, they obviously always think about Sri Lanka, but they've thought a lot about Sri Lanka this year. I've heard from a lot of them. They are very sad about what has happened here. They're wanting to contribute, and they are contributing, whether it be financially or through other means. And I think that's probably true of Sri Lankans around the world, that this year has meant a big focus on what's happening back home and how you can help.
Do you think that the Sri Kiwis sort of fail the TEBIT test when it comes to cricket, and that they never support, even though they may have the citizenship of their adoptive New Zealand, that when it comes to cricket they would always support Sri Lanka? Or do you think that is now? I don't
believe in this test. I think it's a completely unfair thing to do, because you know, people can have loyalties to several countries simultaneously, and like why you choose particular sporting loyalties will depend about your particular circumstances. My father is English, and he came to New Zealand at the age of 35, and he decided to move from being an English supporter to a New Zealand supporter because all of his children did, and he didn't want to be supporting a different team. Does that mean he fails? I don't know, but you know, so I think but the Sri Lankan, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi cricket teams, when they tour, they have so many fans, often in the cricket stadiums, often more fans than the New Zealand team does, and that's kind of cool that you have, you know, passionate support for both sides in a cricket tour.
High Commissioner Michael Appleton, thank you very much for being on Newsline Live.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is the way it was on Newsline Live this evening, with the High Commissioner of New Zealand in Sri Lanka, High Commissioner Michael Appleton. Thank you, take care, have a great evening, and as always, God bless you all.